know, when people visualise a cottage garden, this is the kind of thing they have in mind. Little curving path, virtually no lawn, and great masses of colour everywhere coming from annuals and perennials of all kinds, and all seemingly indiscriminate. And yet, how many people realise that several hundred years ago, the cottage gardens in those days were nothing but cabbages and turnips and swedes and potatoes. They were survival gardens. It was only about 100 years ago that people started to put flowers in them. This is a magnificent example of a cottage garden. Let's look at it more closely. First of all, what about the roses? Well, they all have a significant role to play in any cottage garden. This one is a standard rose, and it suits this particular scene, but being top heavy, it needs to be very firmly staked indeed, and later in this video Colin's going to show us all the tricks about staking. But let's look closely also at the lawn area. Well, it's not really a lawn at all, is it? It's a grassy path, and this is another great characteristic of a cottage garden. And look at the plants. They're all shapes and sizes. These are foxgloves, and I realise they're a major weed pest in some parts of Australia, not here, although they do sell seed around the place. But look at the way that all these plants have been allowed to grow. No staking, but kind of leaning around and drooping around in all directions, and that adds to the charm of this kind of a garden. And surely no cottage garden will be complete without an archway. In this case, festooned with two different kinds of roses. And the interesting thing about archways is where you place them. Usually at the entrance to a garden, or where one part of the garden leads into the next. They look great. The wonderful thing about traditional cottage garden plants is they're so easy to grow. Here's candytuft, which flowers non-stop through spring and summer. Columbines that come up year after year and in brilliant colours. Penstemons, another outstanding perennial plant, and campanulas with great blue globes of blooms. Lupins galore, and of course St. John's wort, an ancient herb. I suppose the marvellous thing about the modern cottage garden is you don't really need a cottage at all. You can use a modern home or a flat, as long as you've got a little bit of land, a bit of garden in which to plant whatever you like that's going to give lots and lots of flowers. Not big trees or large shrubs, but generally a good mixture. And the other wonderful thing is you can use Australian plants as well and mix them in. They look great. And you can obtain year-round colour as well. So things are looking great, and that's what this video is all about. How to create your own magnificent cottage garden. I think you're going to love it.
Well, this is our house in the middle of our street. Annie and I bought this 110-year-old sandstone cottage 12 months ago, and we decided on a cottage garden to sort of blend in with the home. The only snag was there was a kikuyu lawn all over the front and one at the back, so we decided that had to go. And I started watering it and fertilising the lawn to spray it out with glyphosate. But I've got to tell you, that's when the neighbours and Annie's friends really were convinced I'd lost my marbles. I mean, why feed and water a lawn if you're going to kill it? But that's what you've got to do to get glyphosate to really work. Anyhow, 3 months we'd convinced ourselves that that lawn was dead, but then 3 big trees. They had to go because you can't establish a cottage garden full of flowers under 3 big trees. That created a few problems. Felling the trees was the really easy part. Then I daubed the stumps with an arboricide, the active agent being triclopyr, not only to kill them, but to prevent suckers from forming. After a few tries of digging up the roots, I admit I had to get a stump crunching contractor in. And then I realised that some of the chips being spread around the garden contained residues of triclopyr. I decided to cover the whole of this area with 6 cubic metres of this recycled organic material, and the reason for that is to allow me enough time to let that triclopyr leach into the soil so it wouldn't affect the plants I wanted to put on top. Also added gypsum to improve the drainage, 300 grams per square metre over the whole of the area, and that certainly improves the drainage. And then in one weekend, got in and planted the lot. We decided on a mix of annuals for instant colour and some slower growing perennials and bulbs. Some of the masterpiece blend of pansies were actually in flower when we planted them, and they've grown very quickly to make a good ground cover in just 2 months. I get in and deadhead the pansies, by removing the spent flowers there, every couple of days, and that keeps them looking really fresh. The Matilda poppies have flowered right through winter, but they get a bit tattered by the wind, so if you want them as cut flowers, you need to pick them in the morning when the buds just straighten out before they split open. The Dianthus gemfire, just starting to flower, and they'll really take off when the weather warms up. One of the problems I have encountered is a short-term nitrogen deficiency. We call it nitrogen drawdown, and it's caused by the fact that this compost is still breaking down and depleting the soil nitrogen that's available, and so the plants go a little bit yellow. Easily overcome by additions every 2 weeks of a water-soluble nitrogen. And I've added a little bit of kelp to this to act as a buffer. Pretty easily done, bit of an overspray, problem solved. I've planted 45 pots of perennials in here to take over from the seasonal effect of the annuals. The Marguerite daisy establishes very quickly and it makes a lovely compact habit. We both like the perennial wallflowers, so I chose the cultivar Winter Joy, and we've planted lots of spring and summer flowering bulbs. The liliums are starting to come through now, and so are the iris and garlic too. However, the tulips and the narcissus have already finished flowering. I'm not so sure that the cottage garden purists would regard that as a cottage garden, but I've had a lot of fun laying it out, and it's certainly been done economically. Under $600, less than 3 months, and it was all planted in one weekend. Annie loves it, and I think the neighbours do too.
Mate. Well done, mate.
We're at Cashmere on the northern outskirts of Brisbane City, and a setting like this is probably the last place you'd expect to find a garden chock full of perennial plants, but there is just such a garden here. What makes it even more unique is the fact that this hard, clay, gravelly soil is almost devoid of nutrients and terribly hard to work with. Perennials are not generally recognised as being easy to grow in the hot, humid summers of Queensland. But 5 years ago, Leonie Kearney set about to develop just such a garden in this extremely uncooperative environment. In August 1991, the block looked like your average building site, with the house surrounded by some bare, unfriendly dirt. Some lawn was laid, and then in went the first of the garden beds. Gradually, the garden started to take shape, but even at the end of the first year, it was still hard to visualise the beauty that was to follow. It's really hard to believe that this transformation could have taken place in such a short time. And it's also pretty obvious that Leonie's achieved remarkable success in growing these seemingly hard to grow plants in this climate because she's been invited to enter her garden in the Australian Open Garden Scheme. This path has been softened beautifully by the plants tumbling over its edges, and the height gradation from the back of the bed to the front, along with the colour combinations, are the mark of a gardener who knows what she's about. It has a real cottage garden feel to it. Leonie has green genes. Her mother, grandmother and sisters are all gardeners. As a child, she used to visit her grandmother and she'd bring back seeds so that she could propagate them. When Leonie moved to this property, she brought with her 3 truckloads of plants from a previous garden. These included treasured things like bulbs and perennials and lilies. Obviously, they've all merged in with the others now. No matter where you walk in this garden, you're sure to find some interesting colour combinations. Here we've got a lovely purple salvia behind a pink geranium. And a little further on, there's the common old orange salvia, and in front of that's another pink geranium, this time with variegated foliage. This is an attractive part of the garden. The bright purple flowers of the warm climate bulb, the babiana, contrast well with the golden flowers of the hardy gazania. The mauve and white flowers of the verbena give a softening effect and match the perennial status. Behind them all stands the strident foliage and flowers of the white watsonia. When summer comes, so too does the rain, buckets of it, so excellent drainage is called for. I'm out the back of the garden with this lovely bank beside me, and whilst this provides great drainage, during periods of really heavy rain there was quite a lot of erosion, so Leonie got these big rocks placed and that stabilised the bank. Mulching's terribly important in a garden like this, so they use animal manures and lawn clippings and eucalyptus leaves to provide a good solid mulch. The plants growing on this bank are doing so well, like this lovely kalanchoe and the daisy behind it. They're both looking just stunning at the moment. Here's a plant you don't see very often in Queensland, the lovely yellow-flowered perennial linaria. And it looks great by the red dianthus and the purple verbena. Makes a brilliant show. All this goes to show that even though the gardening books say it can't be done, there's always someone who's willing to give it a go.
Before you rashly make dramatic changes in the garden, you need to have some sort of idea or plan in your mind of what the outcome will be. First, look at the existing situation. The background vegetation or view is important. In this case, it's a mixture of deciduous shrubs like hawthorn and berberis, plus some evergreen rhododendrons which are well established. Then you should consider the aspect in relation to sun and shade at various times of the year, and where the area is in relation to existing paths and walkways. This magnolia is a spectacular feature, so I'd like to place some seating over here so it can be really appreciated. Then I'd like to take the path in a big wide sweep around here to the pergola, and this entire area I want to plant out with a mixture of shrubs and perennials and bulbs and annuals that'll give me colour at various times of the year, not just one dramatic splash and then nothing for 11 months. We dispensed with the lawn in the corner of the garden using a rotary hoe. Then we laid out a path and smothered the bed with a good organic mix in preparation for planting. So now it's time to choose the plants. The colours in the background here give us some clues about the sort of colour scheme we can put into this garden bed. There are some purplish rhododendrons, and in spring there's a wonderful yellow Banksia rose that cascades over the hedge. Then of course there's a dramatic geranium madurense and some yellow mollis azaleas that have just finished flowering. I think taking all of that into consideration, that yellow and blue and purple will be a fantastic colour scheme for this garden bed. Of course you don't have to have a colour theme. Gardens can work just as well with lots of colours mixed together. But choosing complementary colours, even if they're contrasting like yellow and purple, will create more unity and there's less chance of a colour clash which can spoil the effect. When you're planning a bed like this, there are lots of things to be considered. Foliage colour and texture is just as important as the colour of the flowers. Try and mix up various types of foliage because the plants will be better defined and it will look more interesting. Then there's height and flowering time to be considered. I prefer to stagger flowering throughout the year rather than having one short burst of colour. For most of us, choosing the plants can be quite overwhelming.
Yes, I know, they're all over the place.
I've chosen some good basic shrubs as the backbone of the garden. There's ceanothus, which has brilliant blue flowers in spring, and this handsome hydrangea which will flower right through summer. I've got some yellow daisies for a quick burst of size and colour, and lavender of course, and heliotrope, and this excellent native ground covering shrub. It's a hybrid scavola and hopefully it will survive the winter up here. You see how I've mixed up so many different foliage types and colours? Then there's silver or grey foliage, which is very important. Artemisia and Senecio, which will really provide a tremendous contrasting accent. I think silver foliage plants are essential in most mixed colour beds. After you've sorted out a good selection of shrubs, you'll have to consider some perennials, which are great for filling in all sorts of gaps and spaces, and annuals, of course, which will give you some terrific instant colour. Then comes the difficult task of sorting out how to position these plants in relation to each other. First, make a note of their size and spread and flowering time, and remember that the taller plants will have to be positioned towards the back of the border, gradually decreasing in size towards the front. I could draw a plan to see how they'll all work together. Landscape architects and designers work this way, and it's time-consuming and methodical, but very effective. However, I also like to look at the plants and how they relate. I set them out sort of how I want them to go, then I move them around a bit. It all looks pretty good to me. And now to plant. The basic rules of planting are really very simple. Never plant in the middle of the day in summer, and always make sure that the plants are watered well the day before, and the ground too. That will prevent transplant trauma. For big shrubs like this, dig a decent sized hole. There's an old adage, plant a $5 tree in a $10 hole, and it says it all really. When I'm planting a lot of seedlings, I take them out of the punnets first and lay them on a tray. Then I pop them in quickly, mixing some compost in with the soil around them. This may still look rather bare, but you must allow enough space for things to grow, and I'll be adding more plants in autumn, for spring of course. With bulbs, the best effect is gained by planting them in clumps of 3 or more. They can be left undisturbed for a few years, then dug up and divided like these. Because the foliage of bulbs needs to die back slowly after flowering, I'm oversowing the area with lobelia seeds, which will grow up and disguise the unattractive foliage while it's withering. Like all gardeners, I'm casting my mind ahead to the spring when this garden should really start to come alive. Between now and the end of autumn, I'll plant some more annuals to replace the salvias, probably delphiniums, and those combined with the bulbs should create a tremendous splash.
In spring, there's a great array of flowering bulbs: tulips, grape hyacinths, jonquils, daffodils and freesias. But what happens when they finish? Well, there's plenty to choose from to extend the summer flowering period. These are galtonias, or summer hyacinths, and they really give a massed show if you plant them round about July through to September, and they'll flower in summer right through to autumn. They're a beautiful little bulb. You plant them about 10 centimetres deep, and they come up on a stem with these pure white fragrant flowers. They're a great plant to plant in amongst other perennials to give a really massed effect. For early summer colour, you can't beat Asiatic liliums. They look wonderful because the range of colour is really quite spectacular. Plant them about 10 centimetres deep in a cool, moist position and group them together again so that you get plenty of colour coming up amongst other shrubs. They love their heads to be in the sun and, as I say, their roots to be in a cool, moist spot. hard to believe that something would grow from that. It's a perennial plant, Gypsophila, or baby's breath. But when you see the shoots at the top of the crown, you'll know it will succeed. Plant gyp in a sunny spot and just make sure that the crown of the plant is just below the soil surface. Water it in to get it established, and then don't water it too much. Leave it on the dry side over its growing time, and you'll end up with a beautiful mass of frothy white flowers in summer. Yet another strange root system of a perennial plant. It's a Hemerocallis or day lily, and if you plant that in the sun or partial shade, you will get masses of flowers. Plant them any time from June, July through to spring, and in summer and autumn, fantastic array of colours and flowers. Gladioli are making a great comeback. They're terrific to grow in amongst perennials and other plants in the garden. Plant them in a well-drained sunny spot in the garden, about 10 centimetres deep, and you will end up with a garland of gladdies. And they're just a few of the plants you can be growing to give you a guaranteed succession of summer colour.
The daisy family of plants, known botanically as Asteraceae these days, contain at least 21,000 species of plants in 1,300 genera. And they're probably the most widely recognised of all of our flowers, certainly the most widely spread of plant families on Earth. That's a classic daisy. It's a Shasta daisy grown from seed called Starburst, F1 seed. So you'll have to grow it from seed and then divide it as perennials every year to keep those characteristics. You won't be able to collect and save your seed. But when you look closely at it, in common with all daisies, there are absolutely microscopic little units that make up that flower. There are hundreds of tiny flowers all over the head of that particular plant, and these little ray florets around the edge are just decoration. So when the bees get in there to do their job, collecting the nectar and the pollen, they're working on each of those little individual flowers. Some of our well-known daisies are the Coreopsis, lots of different cultivars, but it's the sunny yellow flowers that wave through spring and summer that really make them very popular. Everyone will recognise the Gerberas, and of course the plethora of sunflowers, grown for birdseed and as a snack, not to mention the spectacular effect they'll make in your garden in midsummer through to autumn. You'd probably recognise the globe artichoke as a member of the daisy family, and you'd certainly see the connection between the Jerusalem artichoke and this family when it's in flower. But I'd be surprised if the average home gardener would recognise the lettuce as a daisy. But just let one bolt to flower and seed and you'll certainly be convinced. This is the white flowering form of Echinacea purpurea, and it's a plant that's acquired almost cult status amongst herbalists because the whole of the plant has an active agent that acts as a stimulant to our immune system, and it's being used to ward off the common cold. Lovely daisy. The Gazonia is probably one of our most widely planted daisies in Australia, and it is so widely planted because it outcompetes almost everything, even couch grass. But the minute it gets outside of the garden, it's a weed. And that's what we've got to be careful of. So many of these daisies are so vigorous and hardy, able to outcompete other plants, they have enormous potential to become environmental weeds and escape into our bushland, and that's a problem.
Annuals are plants that complete their life cycle within 1 year, and they're generally planted either in autumn for a spring display or in spring for flowering in summer. There's a tremendous choice of annuals available at this time of year. Nemesia, alyssum, pansies, lobelia, petunias and lots more. If if you don't have space in the garden, you can always plant annuals into containers, put them into a sunny place till they come into flower, then bring them into a prominent position for a fantastic display. Here's how to get the best results. Either use a top quality potting mix or a cheaper one that's been boosted up with your own compost and some slow release fertiliser. Fill the pots to within 5 centimetres of the rim, then get your annuals ready for planting. I always take all the little annuals out, squeezing the bottom of each tube, and lay them on the tray, then plant them all in one hit. It's better to overplant into containers because it gives a really generous overflowing effect. And if you're planting out a hanging basket, use annuals that trail over the edge like lobelia or petunias. Don't overwater the pots, but by the same token never let them dry out, and use a liquid organic fertiliser every fortnight from planting time because this will really boost them along. Some annuals, like violas and pansies, really benefit from the tips being pinched out to encourage more dense growth and extra flowers. Let the freshly planted pots rest in the semi-shade for a day or two, then gradually get them out into the sun, and in 6 to 10 weeks, depending on the variety, you should start enjoying some fantastic flowers.
David Austin has the rare distinction of creating a completely new class of rose, which he called the English rose. His aim was to combine characteristics of old-fashioned roses with modern hybrid teas. The Rose Souvenir de la Malmaison is a beaut old-fashioned one, and it's got many of the characteristics of old-fashioned roses. For instance, these fat, plump buds, soft green leaves, and then the buds that open out into these glorious flowers filled with petals right into the middle. And the more petals there are, it usually means that there's a good fragrance. Now, the contrast between these and the hybrid tea roses is that the hybrid teas have a pointier bud, they have fewer petals, but their great quality is that they flower on and on. They're recurrent roses. After many years of patient breeding and mixing up the characteristics of the old-fashioned with the modern roses, David Austin ended up with these English roses, still with the fine form and fragrance of the old-fashioned, but from the modern roses, well, when that one finishes flowering, you practically turn your back and it's in flower again. They're that good. The colour scheme of the English roses ranges from the soft pastels through to yellows and crimsons. For a pure white, there's Fair Bianca with round buds that open to pretty little cups. It's quite fragrant, a bit like aniseed. It's a short but strong grower to 1 metre high. It's ideal for small gardens. This is a favourite of mine, Wise Portia, a perfectly shaped full petal rose in deep pink. It blooms freely and has a very rich fragrance. Salmon pink and apricot are popular colours right now, and Jacquinetta has a large single soft apricot flower, great masses of bloom over a long period of time. It's a medium grower to 1.3 metres high. A particularly strong yellow is Graham Thomas, with lovely cup-shaped flowers. It's a very vigorous grower, a very memorable plant indeed. And Prospero is a good example in the crimson colour range. It grows to 1 metre high. It's always a good cluster of tightly petalled flowers on long stems. There are many ways to grow English roses in the landscape. You can grow them as a massed rose garden in a formal way, perhaps surrounded by a low hedge, or to hide and clothe a fence or a wall. They look really good. There's some very strong growing varieties. Another way to grow them is as a standard plant on a 1 or 2 metre high stem and a ball of flowers on the top. It looks pretty spectacular. And Dapple Dawn, when it's grown as a hedge, looks great. This one was pruned 2 weeks ago, and now look at these buds that are forming. It'll flower beautifully in another couple of weeks. Great dense screen plant, that one. You don't have to wait until winter when they're bare-rooted to plant them. They can be planted at any time of the year quite easily from a container. Soak the pot in a bucket of water until the bubbles stop rising. Slide the pot off carefully, avoiding root damage, and place the root ball in the hole. Replace the soil so that the bud union of the bush is just above ground level. Water it in well with a full bucket of water and do this twice a week over summer. Feed it in early spring and late summer with some slow-release fertiliser. It's an important but very pleasurable task to come out in summer and deadhead the roses. Just knock off the flowers like that, or if you've got a pair of secateurs, run down the stem when the flowers have finished, about 20 centimetres down, and cut to a lovely fat bud like that. These plants are bred to be graceful and arching. They don't need to be cut back very hard like those hybrid teas you do in winter. It's best just to shape them and prune them to the size that you're wanting, and they'll give you great reward. These make a wonderful cut flower to bring indoors for a floating bowl or for a vase. The English roses. They're the new roses in an old style.
Whenever we buy seedlings, we're buying a promise of things to come, be it beautiful flowers or bountiful vegetable crops. How we select and handle those seedlings will have a large bearing on whether or not that promise is fulfilled. We should always remember that although the seedlings look hardy enough, they're nothing more than delicate young plants that deserve to be treated with the utmost care and kindness. Select small, healthy seedlings rather than long, leggy ones that have usually been reaching up for the light. More often than not, the little ones will catch up to and overtake the leggy ones anyway. Make your seedling purchase the last thing you do before you head off home. Remember, those seedlings have to breathe, so don't leave them locked up in a hot, airless car while you're having a cup of tea. Plant them out in the late afternoon or early evening rather than the heat of the day, and always hold the seedling by the leaves when planting them out, so the stem that carries the nutrients and moisture is not damaged. Water the newly planted seedlings with fish emulsion or seaweed extract to help them overcome transplant shock.
Climbing plants are a fantastic addition to the garden because they add height and produce flowering stems that can be used to frame entrances or cover unsightly fences or outbuildings. One of the most popular climbers is the clematis, or clematis as some people pronounce it, and it's pretty easy to see why it's so well loved. This wonderful bower of blooms is Clematis montana rubens. It's one of the easiest of all the clematises to grow, and it's very fast growing. Here it's all tangled up with a wonderful white Banksia rose. In fact, roses and clematis grow really well together. They're great companions. The name clematis comes from the Greek word klemma, meaning tendril, and this describes the slender twining petioles that help many species to grow. It's quite fascinating how they grow. They're self-climbing, and the petiole forms a coil like a spring that supports them but gives them some flexibility so that they move when the wind blows. They're not rigid, and therefore they're less likely to be damaged in a storm. There are more than 250 species of clematis worldwide. That's more species than there are roses, and they're members of the Ranunculaceae family, which also includes anemones and peonies and buttercups and aquiledias. We tend to think of clematis as being deciduous climbers, but there are also evergreen varieties as well as woody and semi-woody perennials and low-growing clematis that can be grown as ground covers or rockery plants. There are also Australian and New Zealand clematis, and there are species and varieties that will grow in warmer climates. However, most are best for cultivating in temperate to cool or cold climates. Clematis vary in height from a tiny 4 centimetre tall species from New Zealand to an amazing 12 metre tall climber that can easily smother a mature tree. The flowers vary in colour from pure snowy white through various shades of pinks, mauves and lilacs to deep burgundy and purple. In the large flowering hybrid group, there's a myriad of coloured markings and stripes. They really are quite remarkable. Just to add to the diversity of this wonderful genus, there are varieties that flower during every month of the year, not just spring, and the flowers vary in size from the size of a thumbnail to the size of a dinner plate. There are a few tricks to growing clematis successfully, especially these large flowering varieties which were bred extensively in the Northern Hemisphere in the mid-1800s when the first large flowering types were brought to the West from China. They really need a fertile soil that's got excellent drainage, and the climbers will need some sort of post or trellis for support. The hybrids are a little bit tricky because they like to have their roots in the shade, yet they like to grow into the sun. It's what they call having a cool root run, like this little hole in the paving, or you can cover the roots with a few large stones or plant some other shrubs around the base to shade the roots. Keep up the water to clematis in summer, especially during the first couple of summers until they get well established. They're gross feeders. This doesn't mean they have bad table manners, but it does mean that they do like some fertiliser like blood and bone topped up with compost, ideally in late spring and early summer before flowering. And what about pruning? Well, you can happily leave clematis unpruned. In fact, the early flowering varieties such as the evergreens and the montana and alpina group are best left unpruned. All you really need to do is tidy them up a bit if they get unruly. The early large flowering hybrids such as Barbara Jackman and Nellie Moser make their flowers on last year's wood, and if you prune hard you simply won't get any flowers. Anyway, always read the label carefully when you buy clematis. It'll probably tell you what the group is and how to prune it. Another thing I love about clematis are these fluffy feathery seed heads. They're just about as decorative as the flowers themselves. Clematis really are inspiring plants. There's such a great diversity and so many ways they can be used. What more could you ask for?
Now look, I swear I'm not mean, but I do believe in good gardening thrift. And that means that when I go into a nursery to buy plants like this, I pick them with very great care indeed. See this one, it's a cardinal flower. I pick those with lots and lots of shoots. And you know why? It's because for years I've been doing this and I ought to pass it on. Whereas most people get these and put them straight in the ground when they get them home. Not thrifty Pete. I knock them out like that, there they are. And then I cut them apart to all these little divisions here like that with a knife. Or pull them apart, and it means that instead of having one plant, I've got lots and lots of little plants everywhere. Even they can be divided up again, like that, see? Right in the middle, a bit brittle. There they are, there, and there. And each one, and by the way, this cost $6, I'm now getting the equivalent of about $30 worth of divisions. Now, I call that not being mean, but being very good gardening, because every one of those will grow to the full-size plant in a matter of months.
One of the most evocative of all fragrances from plants is lavender. It vividly captures the balmy heat of summer. There are so many varieties of lavender that it can be quite confusing getting the names right for home gardeners. But to make it easy, just think that there are three main groups of lavenders. One's the Stochas variety, another is the Pterostochus, and then there's the Spiker. And the Spiker group is where the English lavenders belong. Lavender angustifolia is one of the English lavenders, and it's what a lot of people want to grow. They're hardy, they tolerate frost and moderate drought, and they flower early from December through to January. The purple flowers are short, on non-branching stems, and the flowers are low in camphor, and that's why this one is widely used for top-grade oil production. There are numerous cultivars of angustifolia. There's Alba, which is white, Rosea pink, and Hidcote is a beauty as a low hedging plant, very purple flowers. This is lavender latifolia, the spike lavender. It has masses of flowers from March through to autumn, and you can see that each flower spike is long and elongated. The flowers are very strong in camphor content, and it makes them good for soap and also for moth and insect repellent. Also in the spiker group is lavandin, or lavender intermedia. A widely grown form of this is grosso, and that's the world's largest oil-producing lavender plant, and its flowers are good for drying and making potpourri. Lavenders originate in the Mediterranean region, and hence we get the Italian and the French varieties, and they're part of another group of lavenders called the Stochas group. This is the French lavender, Lavandula dentata variety candicans. You can see it's got a lovely plump mauve flower bud and beautiful soft foliage, just to make it a little bit different than other lavenders. This one is also different because usually you prune a lavender when it finishes flowering. This one you prune in summer so that in winter it continually has flowers right through spring and onwards. The Italian lavender has mauve purple flowers with lovely violet ribbons at the top, and they flower for a very long time. The problem is that many in the Stochas group cross freely and set seed, and they can spread. Hence they've been declared a noxious weed in many rural parts of the country. Another group is the Pterostachys lavenders, and they're commonly referred to as the fern leaf varieties. This one is Lavandula canariensis, and it's got a very finely divided leaf, rather lacy looking and attractive. And they've got long elongated spikes of purple mauve flowers. All lavenders need well-drained soil. Don't try to grow them in a boggy, wet site, and neither grow them in the shade. They really have to have full sun. They prefer a neutral to alkaline soil, but if you've got a highly acidic soil, add some dolomite lime annually and water that in, and every year give them a small handful of slow-release fertiliser. You can grow lavender by seed, but it's easier to take cuttings. Make them about 6 or 7 centimetres long, snip the bottom leaves off, and then put them into some rooting hormone powder so that they strike readily, and then insert them into some propagating mix that's kept moist. Press them in hard, and you'll find that in about 6 to 8 weeks they'll strike roots. The beauty of lavenders is that they're rarely affected by pests and diseases. However, in Queensland, in the tropics, you'll find that the spiker group do get affected by humidity. Go more for the French and the Italian. They'll stand up to the humidity quite well. And if you grow a lavender in your garden, you'll be greatly rewarded.
Yeah, I know, you're thinking, wow, that looks a mess. But there's a real control in this chaos out here. This is my wife's cottage garden, and Annie's requirement was cut flowers all the year round for indoors. Hey, that's a big ask, I've got to tell you, because you can't go in and just chop the whole lot back in any one season, or you've got no supply. So managing that succession is quite a challenge. This is Glaucium flavum, and in my garden it's a perennial. I cut it back right to the ground in winter, but you can see by midsummer it's made a lot of growth, seed capsules everywhere. If I cut it back halfway, it'll flower again in the autumn, so it's worth doing. Daylilies, or Humeria calis, need to have their day-old spent lilies removed regularly so they don't waste nutrient on seed capsule development. That way, they flower longer. The Marguerite daisy in this climate needs a heavy prune in winter and a light 20 to 30% prune in summer, and that way they'll stay in flower for a total of at least 6 months. This is the little purple Nurembergia hippomanica, and there's a temptation to cut it back from this path by snip, snip, snip through there. But don't, whatever you do that. You lift up perennials and you cut them from underneath. Always get rid of all that dead stuff like that, and you keep cutting it until you're convinced you've reduced most of its bulk. And that way, when you put it back down, you can't see where the cuts have been. Well, the sweet peas look pretty good, a few weeks ago, but they go off very fast with a bit of heat of summer. So clean these out quick smart. I love the Nagila as an early spring flowering annual, and I leave the plants to mature in situ because I harvest them for the seeds, which are great in Indian curries. I plant pansies and poppies for a quick show in winter, and that sort of continues well on into summer or until they get crowded out by the perennial competition. If you want to grow roses in your perennial beds, you're going to have to keep the competition away because the humidity causes black spot. So, Alstrom area, you're out of there. When deadheading your roses, remember that if the flowers and the buds are removed, it's 53 days before they appear again. The bird bath here is kept topped up all year round since the various birds keep the aphids under control on the roses, and I just love the antics of the birds in the early morning. I can manage Annie's cottage garden with about 20 minutes work a week, so that's not beyond most people. And remember, you don't need to chop everything back at the same time. You want flowers all year round, you've got to manage that succession.
To stake or not to stake? That's the often asked question. But just like everything in gardening, there isn't a simple black or white answer. Those who are opposed to staking say that it weakens the plant roots, and so the plant then depends on the stake for support. Whilst I agree with that concept, I think there are times when staking's necessary. So if you do stake, make sure you do it for the right reason and do it correctly. A lot of the weeping standards need support for just about all of their lives. This weeping mulberry was put in about 7 years ago, and there's 2 stakes were put in on either side, and it was tied together with pantyhose to stop it moving in the high wind. Now, of course, it's as firm as a rock and it'll stand up to any wind, so the pantyhose can come off and out will come the stakes. Most people are under the impression that standard roses need staking, and that was the case with this one. But as you can see, it's got a huge root system now, which is just as well because the stakes rotted off at ground level. It's about as useful as an ashtray on a motorbike as far as that rose is concerned. There are a lot of plants, of course, that don't need staking, and things like Australian natives and the shrubby plants leave the stakes off them. Choosing the right stake's pretty important. If you're looking for a short-term measure and only a smallish plant, well, the old bamboo stake's all right, but I wouldn't stake my reputation on it. The hardwood stake does well. It lasts for a long time, tough as old boots, and is very strong, so that'd be great. The reinforcing rod does bend a little bit if it's a fine gauge, so if you want something long, you've got to go to a much heavier gauge than that. But if you want something to last forever, the old star picket's the job. You can either get them galvanised or painted, and they'll last for a lifetime. This is one of my favourites, steak and chips. Remember Dracula? One of these plunged straight through the heart, stopped him in his tracks. And it can do the same for your plant if you drive it through the root ball. So, rule 1, always put the stake in the hole before you plant. Choose the right material for the stake and always put it on the windward side so the wind will blow the plant away from the stake rather than up against it. Don't put the stake too close so the tree's got a little bit of room to move, and that'll make it develop a good root system. And last but not least, if you're planting grafted trees like fruit trees, don't ever have the stake up against the graft because it'll rub on it. When it comes to tying plants, there's lots of material you can use. Pantyhose are great. They're not mine, I hasten to add, but they do last well. They stretch, so that's good. The plant can grow inside them. They will eventually rot, and they will cut through the tree if you leave them there too long, so just keep your eye on them. Hessian's another useful material. You know, it's like the webbing you see in furniture. This does stretch a little bit, but it won't last too long. But what you've got to remember with both the Hessian and pantyhose is to tighten a figure-of-8 knot so the tree can move a little bit. This twist and lock tie material is quite useful for securing trees. It's plastic, it'll last for ages, but because it's not flexible, you need to leave a fair bit on each end so that you can adjust it to compensate for the growing trunk. These purpose-built tree ties are really the Rolls-Royce jobs because they last for ages, they're a little bit flexible, but you can adjust them as the tree grows, so they're great. This hook loop material is also good because it's flexible, stretches a little bit, and it's so easy to use.
To avoid losing track of plants or forgetting their names, why not keep a record of everything that goes into the garden? When you first get a plant home, remove the label. This is the most reliable way of remembering the name. The label can be pasted into a notebook with a quick note about where it was planted along with the date. Gardeners with a computer can do the same thing by keeping a garden file and entering the botanical and common name, the date of planting and the exact position. Some computers will even sort this list alphabetically so you can have a really good idea of all the plants in your garden. Photo albums are another good way of keeping a track of plants. Take shots of the garden beds at key flowering times, especially in spring when the bulbs are out, and caption them with the date and the name of major plants. It's very rewarding looking back on the garden over the years and seeing how it has evolved and how the plants have grown, as well as helping to build confidence about accurate plant identification.
As autumn approaches here in the west, there's less of a focus on falling leaves than other parts of southern Australia, because you see it happens later here. Rather, gardeners are starting to plant and prepare the soil for what's virtually a second spring. You see, the combination of moisture in the soil from rain and warmth means that plants get off to a great start. Well look, there's plenty to do, so let's get into it. Well, this sheep manure really is lovely stuff. Look, when it comes to planting in sandy soils, it's essential to put organic materials into the soil. Things like well-rotted animal manure or cocoa peat, and mix them in the proportion of 1 part of peat to 1 part your soil. This helps to hold the moisture in the soil, and it makes fertilisers far more effective. Regardless of whether it's a tree, a shrub or a vegetable seedling, you need to mix these organics in order to be successful. Prepare now for an explosion of spring colour by planting out bulbs. And remember that tulips and hyacinths need to be chilled in order to flower, so it's a good idea to bung them in the bottom of the fridge for 4 to 6 weeks before planting them out, and then put them out in the best month, May. Sow seeds of winter and spring flowering bedding plants such as sweet pea, poppy and lobelia. Then after the first decent rains of autumn, plant out everlastings by the packetful. Planting sweet pea seeds can result in a wall of fragrance as well as lots of winter colour going into early spring. But it's a good idea to soak the seeds overnight before you plant them out to soften that really hard seed coating. That's going to look great, but there's no rest for the wicked. There's a few more things that need doing. One of the downsides of the wet, warm autumn here in the west is that it encourages fungal diseases, particularly in roses. So you need to keep an eye out for black spot disease, powdery mildew, as well as rust. Also, aphids make an unwelcome return. Look, here's a homebrew insecticide and fungicide that you can make up at home. In a 10-litre bucket of water, rub laundry cake soap to produce a real rich lather. Then mix 7 teaspoons of bicarbonate of soda into the water and mix it well. If troubled by thrips or aphis, add pyrethrum to this mix. Feed lawns before falling temperatures slow down the growth. Pelletised poultry manure can be applied to a dry lawn, and that's certainly the best, and then watered in very thoroughly with a sprinkler. Now, garden beds also need a feed, because this next season is a little bit like a second spring. There's moisture as well as warmth, and plants are going to bolt into flower and into growth. So, get out there and spread the good news around.
This is Winton Cottage at Lura. It was built at the turn of the century and it survived quite a few bushfires in its day. It was also saved from demolition about 15 years ago by a Sydney couple who are keen bushwalkers. They use it as a weekender and sometimes as a holiday let. Being a weekender, the garden simply must be done cheaply and it must also be very low maintenance. And over the next 3 weeks, we're going to transform this area into a wonderful flowering framework for the house, and we're going to do it on a budget. First, we are lifting the existing plants and bagging them to keep them in good condition until we're ready to replant them later on. They should be stored out of the sun, of course. Lifting the lawn is always back-breaking work, which is why I'm getting my son and his mate to help out. I haven't costed labour into the budget, and I hope they'll be happy with a baked dinner at the end of the day. They're creating 2 border beds about 800 millimetres wide that join up with the original beds along the front boundary. The cheapest garden edging of all is the old-fashioned spaded edge, which is created by using a sharp spade to slice into the soil at a slight angle, basically to create a neat mowing edge and to prevent the lawn from growing into the garden bed. The soil here, like most of the soil in the mountains, is quite sandy and impoverished. When establishing a new garden, it's well worth the expense of bringing in some organic matter to build up the soil structure and fertility. If you had a good pile of compost, that would be sufficient, but here we need to import a mixture of topsoil, compost and really well-rotted manure that will get the plants off to a good start. But before we can incorporate this mix, we'll need to consider our watering system. In a bed like this, the hoses are laid in a curved fashion to distribute the moisture evenly to all the plants. Weeping hoses can be bought in kit form or by the metre. Now we're building up the beds with the organic matter to create a first-rate growing environment. Our choice for the hedge is Viburnum tinus, which is a hardy, fast-growing shrub that can be pruned to size and shape as required. It's evergreen with attractive white flowers in late summer, and it will soon join up to produce a solid front to the garden. Along the path, I'm planting Nepeta fascinae or catmint, which will very quickly spread to form a cloud of silver grey foliage and lavender flowers. It will eventually cascade over the edge, hiding the timber framework. Now it's time to replant some of our rescued plants, which include 2 good big clumps of agapanthus. There's a small azalea, and we also have a lot of grape hyacinth, which will make wonderful clumps of purple flowers in the spring. Annuals can be raised from seed and used for a splash of instant colour along the border until the other plants spread to fill the gaps. Having small squares of lawn like this is always a problem when it comes to mowing, so the logical thing is to lift the grass completely and to plant out the whole area. A second length of underground irrigation hose will ensure that all the plants are being watered at root level. Again, this should be installed before the soil mix is brought in, and by laying the hose in a circular pattern, a more even water distribution should result. Now we have created a perfect palette for planting. Ideally, the plant should be placed according to height, with the taller species at the back of the beds and the lower growing plants towards the front. Allow enough space between plants for growth, keeping in mind that most perennials take a few years to reach a good clumping size. I've chosen quite a mixed colour selection, including some lovely white salvias, brilliant yellow rudbeckias, which are quite tall and can go towards the back of the bed, some low-growing asters, which have clear blue flowers that are most attractive. Then we've got dianthus, which are an essential part of any cottage garden. Now here's a great idea if you're on a budget. These are perennials in punnets, which means that for less than the price of a standard plant, you're getting 6 plants. They may be small to start with, but they quickly take off and catch up with the others. The garden really lacks a feature or focal point, so I'm thinking of doing something interesting here in the centre of the smaller bed. This concrete pot doesn't have a hole in the base, which makes it ideal as a water pot for growing lilies. I first fill the base with a mixture of soil and cow manure, then plant 2 miniature water lilies which should thrive in the sunny spot where the pot is positioned. The top of the planting mix is now covered with some gravel to stop the plants from floating away, then topped up with water just like that. It looks wonderful and breaks up the bed a bit. As a finishing touch, we're going to mulch the whole garden with bark. This will prevent weed growth and greatly reduce the need for watering. Our bushwalking couple should be really pleased with this result.
So now you know how to create your own lovely cottage garden. No matter where you live, you can have a beauty. And one thing you'll learn as you're making it, you'll start to become more and more addicted, and you'll be absolutely at peace with the garden for the rest of your life.